Welcome everyone to the Believe in Yourself, Heart&Mind podcast. I am super duper excited for our special guest who is an expert in the mindset, the well-being, and she is a neuropsychologist. She has done really great work just connecting with people, coaching individuals, along with the young or old, starting even in areas like villages in South Africa. So with her background, she is vulnerable in sharing her personal experiences. And one of the things that really stands out to me is her openness in conversing around ADHD. And I would love for you to be able to welcome our special guest, Jaime Jenkins. So Jaime, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, along with the why behind coaching on mental wellness in your area specifically.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. Like you said, my name is Jaime Jenkins, and I am a neuropsychologist, and I work in generally in the field of addictions, but I also work in the coaching arena. And what I love about the coaching arena is I get to interact with people who are maybe not struggling to the point where they would qualify for a disorder or qualify for higher level mental health care, but they really are just struggling with how to deal with their day to day with either their neurosynchronicities or just day to day challenges of relationships. So I love working with people and helping them understand their brain specifically and then how that interacts with the world around them.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure it could be very challenging as well. How do you go about handling your personal challenges while still meeting someone else's challenges? What is a way for you to kind of support yourself in the midst of those kind of difficult conversations?
That's a great question. And I think when we are in our training, whether it's for psychology, or to be a therapist, or to be a social worker, or even just for coaching, they talk a lot in our training about self-care. And I know that this is a buzzword everybody hears, um, but self-care is essential when you're working with other people, when you're listening to what they're experiencing, because you don't want to put your experience into theirs. You want to be present for their experience. So for me, what I do is prior to a session, I learned this from a crime cleanup specialist early in my social work career. And she says that what she does is before she starts working with people or before she goes into a place to clean it up, she takes everything that is her experience, her core, everything, and she visualizes putting it in a little ball and then wrapping that ball in a white light and kind of putting it behind her chest. And so, what that does for her, and what I've done since, is that allows me to allow myself to come out in the best ways, but doesn't allow the darkness to come into me. It kind of keeps anything that is too extreme kind of outside, but it also allows me to be fully present with people so that they don't feel as though they're sharing something that is too much. So that's my first level of self-care. And then I tend to try to have a break at the end of the day and do something physical to literally, T Swift fans would love it, to literally shake it off.
So I'm kind of imagining that first description of having this ball and then making it more clear, bright, and white, and inserting that into you. Is that more of like a visualization, like closing your eyes and take about 30 minutes? Like, how would you describe that? Could you walk us a little bit more through it?
Absolutely. It's a fast process for me. So I don't, it takes about maybe 5 minutes at this point. And I close my eyes and I slow my breathing and I really just do my best. I don't have a mind that can picture actual things. So I more like describe the process to myself in my head, and really just try to feel it. So I'll touch myself where I want the light to be so that I can kind of have that embodied experience with the cognitive.
Wow, that's a really great follow-up description because I am now able to imagine it that Like for me, I'm thinking for so long with like meditation, all these different conversations around it, you kind of like are in your head and you're trying really hard to visualize. And as you were speaking about, like sometimes there are people who may have a difficult time, imagining those things, and that's okay too. And I was like, wow, that's a really great thought to have, because we are all different learners and we can see and feel different things. But I think to focus this a little bit is I love the fact that you shared around the idea of feeling, and everyone can feel. And I think that's such a powerful experience to have when you can reconnect with your emotions and embody
Mhm.
it. Instead of just saying, oh, it's just something that's abstract, you're actually experiencing it. And I think that's such a really impressive and powerful way to connect with yourself before you connect with someone else, or allow yourself to have that presence as you were speaking. And then the other thing I wanted to add was the really cool part is I think you're a kinesthetic learner. That's really awesome, because I think I am too, but I just didn't know all the different kinds of tools to go about having this type of conversation with other people. And it's really great that you're just like describing as, let's get up, shake it off, walk away. Is it more of like after like the end of the day when you finish all your day's work, or is it more towards like each sessions that you've ever had, and then clear
Mhm.
that for the next round of things you have to do?
That's a great question. And I think it would really depend on the day, and it depends on the content of the sessions that I'm having. So in generally, when I'm doing more executive coaching or like helping people with that, we're not getting to the center of people's onions. We're not talking about like deep history. So in the coaching arena, it's a little easier. Obviously, people do still share their challenges and struggles. Whereas in the therapy world, it becomes a little bit heavier and a little bit more important. So it really depends on that and how back to back I have people. I attempt to not do it, but even if it's just like for one song, I think music is very helpful in all of this. So I think if you can just do it even for one song, if it's really heavy, maybe you have to go out for a walk and do some more work. But it's really just starting to understand and get to know your own inner world and how you need to do it, and really just experimenting until you find something that feels good. And if it stops feeling good, just try something different.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think there's always room for evolving. You don't have to
Absolutely.
stay the same just to know that you're growing. The fact is, that's the beauty of it, right? You don't want to stay the same in a sense. You kind of, as you age, you kind of like learn and mature and grow with all your different experiences, and learning how to kind of adapt and like make sense of those things that you carry through in your life experiences. And I want to quickly segue into the
Mhm.
distinction between therapy and what you do as a neuropsychologist.
Mhm.
What is the difference, and why should people go to you versus when you might consider saying, hey, therapy might be a better idea?
I think that this is probably one of the biggest questions out there. And I think I feel like even those of us within the field can struggle with this sometimes, about where those lines are and where the boundaries are. And how the easiest way I can describe it is, for me, coaching is not delving into and not trying to work on the deeper things that are causing you some strife. We all have them. We all have either little t or big T traumas in our life, and they have all affected us in different ways. So if you find that your problem is you're really stuck with that trauma, then therapy is probably a better place to go, because they're going to help teach you things that can overcome or really go back and heal. Whereas I see coaching sitting in a place where it acknowledges that that exists and that is a challenge for you, but also helps you with the day to day functioning. So, how are you going to either wrap that in a ball and put it away so you can get through your day? Or how are you going to notice the things that come up for you and move through them without necessarily having to go back deep into there? I think both are essential if you think about the spectrum that people land on. And I think often it's okay to have both. It's okay to have one and then the other, or to go back and forth. Things come up at different times depending on what's happening for us. So really evaluating. And I think the most important thing for people to know is that having a good fit with the person on the other side. So if you leave a session, whether it's a coaching session or whether it's a therapy session, and you feel way worse than you went in, that's probably an indication that it's not the right person for you. It can be challenging within those sessions, and you can feel challenged and go through difficult emotions, but you shouldn't leave any therapy or coaching session feeling worse than you left before. And I will give another caveat is that the coaching industry, and sometimes in different countries, the counseling industry isn't as well regulated as the therapy industry. So just doing some background checks on people, making sure they have education, making sure they may be certified by the International Coaching Federation or something like that. Just making sure that you're not going up against a snake oil salesman.
Wow, that's a lot of good information right there. And I wish I could have listened to this before, years ago, when I was looking into therapy or figuring out, should I talk to a psychologist or how to like a counselor? Like, what are all these different terminologies? And I know even back then, as you were saying, there's still some nuances and like debates and all these different things. So I don't know if people will ever really hash that out clearly, but I think to your point, you never should ever leave a session feeling worse is a good sign to take on, because I personally have had experiences where I felt worse and I was like, oh no, let's give it another try. Might be better, you know, that mentality of like, oh, just give people a chance and like that.
Yeah.
You know, that maybe you just kind of like you don't know as much as the other person because they're supposed to be the expert, etc., right? And
Yeah.
you don't really learn how to listen to your intuition in a sense. So I do want
Mm.
to ask you that question of like, how do you help people hear themselves even though you're the expert?
I'm the expert in the things that I've studied. So I'm really good at psychology and the psychology and neuroscience of mental health. I know that. But what we know, and if you know enough about that, then everybody's experience is unique and individual. And you are the expert in your experience. You're the expert in how that is happening, how you're processing that, and how you're perceiving that. Two people can go through the exact same experience and have two different, completely different outcomes and perspectives on it. So I think the beautiful thing when you find the right counselor, therapist person for you is that it becomes a melding. So here's what I know about how the brain works. Here's what you know about your experience. And when we bring that together, it should give you a better understanding of why that's your experience and why you're perceiving that way, and a few tools to help you deal with the roadblocks that you may come across because of your way of viewing. So I would never be the expert in somebody else's experience. And I would never say that because I know something from the books that that's their experience, because we have to remember that most of science and social sciences are no different, are based on averages. So there's always going to be people who don't fit that exact thing. And if you're trying to force people's experience into that, it's generally a sign of a newer therapist because they're trying to do their best and not do any harm. But as you get a little bit older, it becomes a little bit more of an art of how to blend those two things.
Wow, okay, a blending, like a almost like a co-partnership, right, of expertise.
Exactly.
And I would love for you to maybe just think about like for people who are still unsure about this work, if there's a specific example of a maybe a scenario, whether it's difficult or simple, where the client is having a challenging situation and you're able to work together. And what were the outcomes of that experience? And was it
Mhm.
you recognize it? the individual who recognized it? How does that go about?
I think it tends to come about as a mutual discovery. It's better, I think, when the other person does, because when you have insights, it sticks harder and it sticks in you more than when somebody gives you an insight. So I think for me, this happens most often. I am a white middle class Canadian woman, a cisgendered woman who has often counseled people from outside of my culture who may identify from the 2S LGBTQIA community, things that I really have no experience in and can't understand. I can't understand the experience of somebody who has come up in a different culture or things like that. So when they bring those things to me and we put it out in front, and I bring in a psychological perspective, which is again very biased towards people of a certain ethnicity and experience, we have to kind of start breaking down some of that together and really talking about the internal. And I will make suggestions to say, well, this is sometimes how the brain works. Does that resonate for you? And we'll go back and forth until we get to a place where they can really say, oh, there it is. And I think when I've had that with people from other cultures more specifically, it's a beautiful moment because it's them really just getting to the core of them and saying, oh, there. I think the best one for me is when somebody realized that their own inner power, so their own decisions and things like that, that they could bring into those situations and how they could use the best of themselves to get them through the humps. So it's never really a specific scenario, but more just what happens when you're in the mess and making the art.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that you described that way, that you are able to hear the person for where they're at instead of trying to go in with assumptions. And it also tells me that the client is the one who's doing a lot of the sharing and making sense of the information with you. And all you're doing is, in a way, in my opinion anyway, is like you're kind of trying to help sort with your expertise, but then it's like laying out all the cards, right? And then figuring out where to focus it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then, okay, what are those steps to kind of like prioritize so that you can have those breakthroughs? And I think that's such a powerful reminder that just because someone's different from you doesn't mean you can't really connect. And that when you learn how to listen, you can actually receive the person for who they are. So could you help me understand maybe how you set up this safe space for such difficult conversations? And um, what are some of the feedback that people give you to help you continue to improve?
Mm-hmm. I think the best way to say is that I've gotten here by making a lot of mistakes. I was once a young therapist and counselor too, and there was times when I can look back and say, "Ooh, I pushed too hard there, and that was wrong, and I could have stepped back, or I inserted my perspective a little bit too much there, and I can see now why that was wrong." And I will say that I will also advocate for more people of color and more diverse people to enter into this field, because I do think that there is something magical sometimes that happens when you can have some of that shared experience and that. But for me to create a safe space, it's a lot about time. It's not doing what I did when I was younger and expecting everything to get put out in one session or to really just allow people to come to you. I was fortunate that most of my early experience was with teenagers. So I learned a lot about how they won't cooperate for a long time. So often I won't start talking about the issue. I very rarely will sit down, except in the intake session where we're going to kind of talk about what you're hoping to get out of it, what your challenges you're facing. I will very rarely sit down and talk about the issue specifically. We'll talk about especially at the beginning, we'll talk about music. We'll talk about the things that bring you joy, the things that lighten you up. And as we start getting deeper into things, little things will start coming up. And if I can pick up on the things that they're saying and just ask gentle questions about it, that tends to get there. I think knowing as well that the space you're in with either a therapist, a counselor, or a coach should be 100% confidential. So, this really should be a space where you can say and talk about the things that you would never bring up with anybody else. And you should feel safe. And if you're having some of that hesitancy, then that's okay. It's normal to feel that way. And you shouldn't feel pressured into opening up in any sort of timeline. Now, that is a very privileged position, and I do work in public health, so we don't charge people often for our services. So there is that caveat. So I definitely don't want to, if people are paying, I don't want to just sit there and talk about their favorite song for the whole time. So I'll try to direct it a little bit more general, but just letting people know that this is a non-judgmental space. I've seen and heard a lot of things, and this is a place for us to hold some of that, and you shouldn't have to worry about that going anywhere. So I think confidentiality, time, and really just talking kind of around the situation about things that bring people joy really helps me set the stage for people.
Wow, I never thought to just think about like casual conversation in a setting like that, which, like you were saying, it can take a lot of time, but it does build trust because now you have a place to connect instead of feeling like there's a void and it's just, you know, back and forth of like, okay, when is this gonna be over? But then now what
Yeah.
you're doing is you're building a relationship that is long term and you're following them throughout their life path journey and
Mhm.
saying just keeping this confidential, but also really it's like having a confident partner to like, you know, share ideas that is very personal that you may
Mhm.
not ever share with someone else, but you need someone to kind of walk through with, because if you're only in your head, how are you going to be able to grow and, you know, take the next leap and or step, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, well, yeah. So
As
what is super powerful? Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, and to be honest, like if that's all you're getting out of therapy, AI is incredible these days. And AI knows probably more. They have access to all of the history of psychology, neuroscience in an instant. So if you're just looking for like a flat answer, I mean, you can have a conversation with an AI bot, and I mean, they are doing amazing things. But I think the beauty of being human lies within our ability to connect with others, and that's where some of that magic happens is in the relationship. It's no secret in the therapy world that that relationship is essential, and that's really where the magic happens. Different modalities will tell you it's how they do it or their perspective, but ultimately it comes down to that human connection, which I don't think you'll get from AI. I do think there's a lot of benefit to AI coming in and really helping some people with certain things, but um, they'll never be able to replace that full relationship.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that topic in because it's
Mm.
so relevant with all that's happening right now in 2023 and the talk of like AI is taking over different jobs or opportunities, or you know,
Mhm.
you got to level up your skill sets if you want to be able to look and sound competitive and things like that. But at the same time, as you were speaking, the the gist of this conversation is that real human relationship cannot be replaced
Mm.
because we're able to interact with each other on a level that's more identifiable in terms of like all our sensories, our experiences, and the different, you know, the variations that, you know, accumulate into a conversation is what creates this really unique experience. But if I get only a general perspective, or it's more catered to like my way of doing things and thinking, perhaps I'm just going to be very narrow in terms of what I know and less likely to understand what other people might be going through, and that my way is not really, you know, in this case, the correct way for everyone. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, so
Yeah,
I just,
you can get some really great insights, but I think you said it at the beginning, that vulnerability piece. And when you're being vulnerable with AI, I think you can probably do it. I don't know if there's been many studies, but there's a difference when you open yourself to be vulnerable in front of a real live human being, even if it is on Zoom. There's something different. And I don't have any studies to back that up. I really just have anecdotal experience, but it feels different when you're being vulnerable with a real human, as opposed to really just being vulnerable with yourself and something that's feeding back, and can get very tailored, exactly like you said, but it's going to be tailored to you and not as specific as it could be with another human.
that's a really, yeah, you're really great insight. And I wanted to I was actually very curious,
Mm,
you know, like talking to you before. Um, there is a lot of, there are a lot of parents or even kids today and adults who are not diagnosed with ADHD or just don't really understand mental health awareness in general, but the idea of like burnout, stress, and
mm,
like general conversations around that could, you know, be a highlight. But then, how did you personally know to get help or
mm.
recognize in yourself that perhaps there's something about my brain that works a little differently, and maybe I really need to look into this further?
That's a excellent question, and I do think it's on top of mind. And I am one of those late diagnosed ADHD humans. And I mean, the reason is I'm in my 40s. So I came up in the 80s. They didn't quite know as much about things, certain things back then. So there was that. There was also the fact that I was high achieving. So I could mask a lot of things. And I was actually able to cope, and I really enjoyed my brain. I always knew that it kind of worked different. I didn't fit in things. There was signals along the way that in retrospect, I can kind of point to them and say, oh, okay, knowing what we know now and laying that filter over top, it's very obvious. But back then, it wasn't so much. I was very introverted. I kept my internal experience to myself. I was lucky that my hyper focus happened to be things in school like writing, eventually psychology and neuroscience. So I did well. So there was never any indication that I should get help. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't struggle, and I absolutely had my struggles, but it didn't really become a problem to me because I had a high level of coping ability. I could mask pretty well until I had children. And when I had children, I was no longer only responsible for me, my schedule, all of that, or making sure that I ate. If I don't eat in a day, if I forget and get hyper fixated, it's not healthy for me, but it's me. And so that's fine. If I forget to feed my children, on the other hand, that's a problem. So, taking on two children, and then as I got older, my hormones started changing as well. And that made my ability to cope very difficult. I also got to a point in my career where I am the executive director, so I'm responsible for an organization and the people within it. And that just became too much for my coping skills. So my healthy coping skills no longer worked for me. And it was becoming almost impossible for me to get through my days in a way that was very functioning. So I got diagnosed. I had a period where I thought maybe I was lying, and I have all this neuropsych background. I knew the answers they needed, so maybe I was fooling. So I went off medication and realized that no, I was not fooling anybody except for maybe myself, and went back on the medication. And what I found for me with medication, and obviously this is a very personal thing, um, is that it helps me quiet my mind often and allows me to execute on tasks. So I can actually complete a load of laundry from washing, drying, folding, and putting away, which is impressive. for me. But it was really that realization that I had been able to cope. I didn't need medication growing up. I probably could have used some counseling or some skills that would have helped make it not such a hard struggle. But it wasn't until a lot of my internal hormones and my external challenges became greater that I actually do, at this point, need the medication to help me. And I will say that it was really TikTok that pushed me over the edge. I've studied it. I've kind of identified like traits in myself that I was like, maybe this makes sense for me. But it wasn't until I started seeing other late diagnosed people on TikTok talking about their experience. And I know that a lot of professionals struggle with that self-diagnosis and that kind of trend of diagnosing yourself. But the reality is that our books are limited, access to doctors is limited. So if you're identifying with somebody who's explaining something, especially because it is such a spectrum and cluster of symptoms, it's okay. And if you find something that helps you with that, great, even better.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, the genuineness of sharing your experiences is profound, especially if it allows others to connect and feel like they're not alone and stop doubting or questioning themselves. I think that's super powerful that you're able to recognize that you weren't alone and that there are people and that maybe you do need to kind of look further and support yourself. And first of all, I just want to congratulate you, like the fact that you are a hardworking mother, an executive director, a leader, someone who is constantly there to create space for and safe space for other people. The fact that you've gone through challenges as a child, but still continue to focus and really find ways to self-help. I'm sure it must have been difficult, like you were saying in the 80s, but then at the same time, you still overcame that despite the limitation of the knowledge during those experiences. So I would definitely, I want to recognize you for that because there could be a lot of criticisms going around when people don't understand. And
Mhm.
in a way, you had to kind of face that by yourself.
Mhm.
But now you're, someone who's more knowledgeable, more mature in your understanding of your practices and also like working with other people. I think it's super empowering to hear you use all of those, uh, you know, real life experiences and be, again, transparent with others. How much more valuable information and going back to even like AI, right? How much more valuable information
Mhm.
because you stepped in and said, hey, I'm going to own my story and I'm going to recognize that there are things that I just didn't know, but here I am. And I've learned from that and I'm going to share that with others. So thank you for doing that. I just want to recognize that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do feel, and I appreciate you framing it that way and owning my own story because it is true. And yes, I definitely had challenges and I would minimize them often because I do, again, come from a seat of privilege. It's a privilege that I didn't struggle more in school. And it was largely due to not having all that external struggle when I was a kid that I was able to kind of learn a lot of those coping mechanisms, even if I was kind of muddling through it on my own. And so I think I will own my own story, but I'll also own the privilege within that story.
Powerful. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight something really specific in one of your earlier comment around your younger self that you are still high achieving.
Mhm.
That's a bit of a conflict of like ADHD. You've seen and heard kids who just like need to move around and they can't sit,
Mm.
they can't do well. Like they need to be sitting in a small group setting, like up, things like that.
Yeah.
how do you talk about that?
Sure, sure. I think the presentation in like female presenting or girls can be very different. We tend to have the inattentive type. So you may know the girl who just sits and looks out the window and appears to be like daydreaming. The internal experience of that is very different. And that's where that hyperactivity can come into is a flurry and a fluster of of ideas or thoughts or things like that. And so externally, they're not presenting like maybe some of the boys tended to present. And that was kind of, especially back then, and that persists until today, is that we see this image of the ADHD human as being one who is very impulsive. The impulsivity can come in different ways. So it is not being able to wait your turn in a conversation or jumping over somebody or just feeling that internal, like, I'm about to burst if I don't say this thing. I think the other side to that is the hyperfixation that can come in ADHD. And I appreciate you calling out kind of that contradiction because that is inherent in ADHD, is that it is such a broad spectrum of symptomology that they can be very contradictory. So can't sit, if something's boring to me, then I will sit there, I'll glaze over, I'll be in my internal world, I'll be unable to engage with it, like editing something or going back over something. But if I'm really into it, then I can sit there, I could be there for hours and not notice that time flies. So the ability to get into a flow state in ADHD, if it's something that interests us internally, is incredible and can be very powerful. My favorite doctor, Dr. Ned Hallowell, who also has ADHD himself, who has done significant research, likes to say that the ADHD brain is a race car engine. It's got an amazing engine. It can go 0 to 100 in minutes. It can do all those powerful performance things. Unfortunately, it's been equipped with bicycle brakes. So the ability to control some of that, that's where it gets challenged, in that even if I really, really wanted to do something before I was medicated, it was impossible for me to get my dopamine to produce so that I could actually have a movement. And that's where I think some of the challenge comes in, is the internal experience versus the external appearance often.
Can you just elaborate that one part right there, the last sentence, where
Sure.
dopamine piece of it, like what do you mean that it takes you
Mhm.
time to move?
So our dopamine system is indicated in a lot of things, but ultimately its job is to give us the ability to communicate with our body to say, okay, this muscle is going to move. And in people with ADHD, they will often have the desire to do something, they'll have the urge to do something, but that system won't kick in for them to give them the physical ability to be able to do it.
Thank you so much for clarifying about the dopamine piece. That makes a lot more sense in terms of like the movement and like the chemical component of it in our body. And so I wanted to just also clarify just one other thing in your story about like
Mhm.
your experience for transitioning from, you know, one being a young woman to someone who
Mhm.
is a mother. And I think there isn't a lot of conversation around that, to be honest, of like
Yeah.
the fact that there is a flux of hormones, not just when you're growing as a girl and going through puberty and things like that, but there is still an additional set of changes that happens after.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it affected you to the point where you weren't able to focus or maybe do things that you normally were doing. Could you kind of
Mhm.
elaborate a little bit more on that? What really happened that really showed you like, hey, I probably need to kind of check in on something more regarding my well-being?
Hmm. That's a great question, and I think it feels like it crept on me slowly, although it probably didn't. I think because of my ability to high mask and to be able to kind of get through, I didn't notice it at first, because I was just doing the things that I normally did. And what I found was that they were that much more exhausting. So I would get home and I wouldn't be able to like keep my eyes open past 7:30, 8 o'clock at night because of trying to keep it together so much at work, and then also having the kids to deal with and that sort of thing. So the energy that I had to be able to deal with things was going. I found at work, even though there were tasks that I've never been good at doing, so, getting things done early or things like that, they became even more challenging. So sitting in front of my computer and knowing that I have to work on this budget, but really not getting to the point where I could even motivate myself. Caffeine, I was up to 6 cups of coffee a day to keep me going through the day, because caffeine is a stimulant, and people with ADHD can really benefit from the use of stimulants because it gets that motivation piece moving again for us. So I think for me, it was a combination of the exhaustion and the inability to do things that, even though previously difficult, I couldn't. And then finally, my ability to mask in situations went away. So things that were highly emotional for me, I work in the field of addictions. It's a very political thing. There's a lot of opinions, a lot of wrong-headed opinions. And generally, I was able to do the quote unquote proper thing, sit in a neutral expression and be able to have a conversation with somebody. That disappeared, and I was unable to hide my emotion. When somebody said something that I found, my brain found ridiculous, my face definitely showed them.
Wow. So I'm guessing you got like some quick feedback, like, hey, I see your reaction, that kind of thing, to kind of help
Yeah.
you be more aware. So there were
Yeah,
some environmental factors there that helped you to see, oh, hey, there's something going on.
absolutely. And it kind of came down to not being able to be a really good partner at home either. So if I wasted, and not wasted so much, but if I had utilized all my ability to keep things together at work and I was coming home and crashing, that meant that I couldn't be an effective partner. I couldn't help parent. I couldn't help do chores around the house. And it was really getting to the point where I was like this is going to start hurting me in ways that if I don't start addressing it, it's going to take me from a place where I've worked very hard to get to and start driving me down.
Wow. And honestly, thank you for sharing that, because in any partnership, just like with your relationship with your client or any relationship in general, like with
Yeah.
a child, right? You want to be present, you want to make time for it. But if you don't even have the mental capacity, and especially if you're not filled up on the inside,
Hmm.
or you don't know what kind of skills or support or how to communicate what you don't understand that you're experiencing, then all it shows is like a hot mess. And
Absolutely.
sometimes people can blame themselves for those things, right? It's like, oh, I didn't do that right today, and it's my fault. Let me, try it, and then you keep on seeing the failing pattern. So
Yeah.
that must be really exhausting.
Yeah, it does. It's exhausting. That shame spiral is a tough one to get out of too. And I mean, we all deal with it to different extents, but to catch it early is key.
Yeah, and so I just want to quickly
Mm,
ask you this question around burnout, because
mm,
you're juggling so much, right? You're you're playing different roles within a day,
mhm, mhm.
and you're also trying to be there for yourself mentally.
Yep.
Um, I'm trying to understand, like, especially given that you're going through the stage in your life where you're also working with your with ADHD, and constant flux of political events going on, etc.
Yeah.
How do you even um balance, or is the word
Yeah.
balance the right word to use?
It is if you understand the amount of work that balance takes. So I think we spoke a little bit before about the external versus the internal experience. And I think yoga masters would tell you that to appear perfectly balanced takes an extreme amount of internal firing of core muscles. So there's actually a lot happening to keep things balanced. So balance could be the right word, acknowledging that it's a constant state of flow. It's not a static thing. And I think some of it plays to my strength. So the variety of things that I have going on plays to my need for novelty and my need for changing things all the time. I think where it starts to get challenging, and I think making a distinction between stress and burnout is important because stress is something we all experience. There's stress that can be good because it creates discomfort in our body and motivates us to move. There's stress that's bad, obviously, in which we get stuck in having too much of like adrenaline or norepinephrine going through our, then it like physically hurts us. And then there's burnout. And burnout is kind of the extreme end of all of these things. And it's when you are in some of these situations, our culture is set up for people to burn out. We have a desire to growth over everything. We have to be continuously growing. To what end? I'm not sure. Things are starting to move faster. Higher demands are being put on people to have things done quicker. It's just not how we are naturally supposed to be. And I think that that extreme level of stress for long periods of times literally leads us to burnout. So you stop being able to produce the things that allow us to get through our days. And when it gets to that point of burnout, it can take years to recover from. So I think it is a balance, but it's also starting to recognize that one, those who have privilege, so being a person in a leadership role, I have to look at what I'm asking of the people around me, what expectations I'm putting on them. So if you are in a place of privilege and you are concerned about burnout, not just for yourself, but for your staff or for anybody that you're working with, recognizing what demands you're putting on them, and then internally learning how you're feeling about them. So tapping into that feeling, if you are like me and you're coming home and you're just exhausted after your days and you physically can't get something going, that could be an indicator that it's the start of burnout or something else that isn't being paid attention to. So I think that it's kind of a combination these days. And historically, we tend to focus on the individual and say, okay, as an individual, what are the things that you need to do to protect yourself from burnout? And the reality is, there's only so much we can do. And we do need to start pushing and advocating for change within our culture so that burnout isn't an expected. It's like if I could set up a place that would be perfect to create burnout. I mean, the Western mentality and the capitalistic mentality would lead directly to that for sure.
Well said. I think a lot of people will probably connect or relate to what you said. And thank you for speaking openly about it, because I think a lot of us may feel it, but don't again know who to go to talk about these things. And actually, one interesting thing that I was talking to a different individual, and he said gratitude can actually be a good place to remind you what are some things that are going well and keep yourself grounded. And I think to your point of stress versus like long-term exposed stress that leads to burnout is the idea that there is some kind of preventative measure by just learning to take a breath and understand that there's a space to show gratitude to either whatever you're doing well or someone else, and connecting with that. And I think back to the point of like AI versus humans is we need to remember that we're trying to have connections. We're connection centered in like type of, you know, I'm not trying, I don't want to use the word species, but like, it's like we are those kind of individuals that need connection, and understanding our nature helps us to also, again, be grounded. And I think the last thing I was going to say was around the idea that you need to probably start stripping away certain things that don't align to your values, right? And if that was the burnout reason was probably, I think, around you're doing way more than what you kind of should be doing for yourself, and like what you really care about, what your potential, where your potential lies in.
I fully agree with that, and I will add some caveats. We could have whole hour conversation about my feelings on the topic of gratitude. The one caveat I will give is that it can turn toxic very quickly, and try to stay within a place of being grateful for things that can fulfill you, and not turning it into, oh, well, I should just be grateful. I have to do, like, I'm grateful I have a job in this economy. It doesn't matter that it's a toxic and my box is. So don't use it as like a hiding thing. Connect to it as best you can in a real way. And then, yes, value-led actions tend to lead less towards burnout, as long as you're, again, maintaining some control over that. As somebody, again, who can hyper fixate on the things that really, really get me, like my core values, I can also overdo it in that. So really just kind of being able to stay fluid and in motion, and being okay with that. And really just checking in with yourself. Is this action moving me closer to my values or further away from it? And then sometimes those values come into conflict. So trying to see which one is most important to you in the moment can be a very good tool to help you make decisions on what to do next.
You sure gave me lots of food for thought. So thank you so much for adding those nuances. Very appreciated. So final question is, who or what inspires you?
That is a big, big question. I had a very powerful experience in my late 20s where I was going to save the world. I was moving to South Africa to live in a tiny little village, and I was going to save the world. I was a 28-year-old person from Canada, and of course I could solve all the problems. Obviously, that didn't turn out so well. I got a big reality check, but what really inspired me was learning from those big leaders. And I think sometimes it's bad to just look at the paragons of people, but people like Nelson Mandela and people like Steve Biko, they believed in their mission. And despite a lot of the external pressures, they were still able to move forward. They were able to move into the core things that are human. They were able to forgive. They were able to work with people that had previously hurt them in a lot of different ways and hurt people like them. So looking at some of these paragons that were able to face the harshest challenges that we have as humans and move through, and whether that is Nelson Mandela or whether that's the 17-year-old kid in my office struggling to get off of cannabis who makes that decision and then does it, both of those things inspire me. Watching people move forward and succeed in their missions, whether it is a big one or whether it's just a personal one that you want to go through, that's really what inspires me and motivates me to move through the day, is the absolute potential that humans have to do incredible things in this world.
I wish you could do a TED Talk. That was really great. You're right. Everyone has huge amount of potential, and we're all here to embrace and understand and witness what those areas of strengths are, and how we can fully use them our skills and things like that to really further the human experience, and I think show kindness. But I really appreciate everything you shared so far. Do you have any other final thoughts for our audience or anything you wanted to share? Or how people can also find you as well?
Absolutely. I'm probably the easiest to find. I'm not a huge social media person, but I do have some. So I'm easiest to find on Instagram at practically awesome, because you'll never be fully awesome. We're always trying to get there. And I think if I was going to leave everybody with something, it is that we all have our internal experiences. We all have our challenges, some greater than others, and recognizing that within that is our humanity. And if we can do something that helps ourselves, but for those of us who are in greater positions of privilege, please don't use that word as something that is scary or causes you guilt. Please just turn that into action. That's that uncomfortable action pace, and start seeing what impacts you can have on the outside world so that other people don't have to face barriers that we were lucky enough not to face.
Wow, well said. Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for being on our show, and thank you everyone for listening, and we hope you have a great day. So
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful.
thank you.